This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support.
Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 40. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So Quinn, who's one of our patrons, wrote in, did you start out as cloud architects, engineers, admins, etc., or did you transition from a traditional sysadmin role to a more cloud-based one when your institutions decided to go cloud? If you transitioned, were you part of the decision-making team that decided to go cloud? If so, why? It seems to me that a well-run on-premise solution is leaps and bounds better than giving up your control and data sovereignty over to some third-party vendor. If you weren't part of the decision-making team that decided to go cloud and you transitioned to a more cloud-focused one, what were your biggest hurdles in that transition? All right, well, shall we start with the origin story piece? So, Gary, do you want to lead us out the gates?
Yeah, sure. So I do not have a degree or anything. My highest qualification is in sound engineering and stage management. And I fell into IT because I decided I didn't want to be a roadie. And I guess really worked my way up the ranks from desktop support through to a traditional sysadmin role that eventually evolved into cloud as we needed it.
That's interesting. So how about the other two of you? Have either of you done software engineering, or I suppose you don't get degrees in cloud engineering, do you?
Maybe today you do, from some university. But actually, it's funny. I actually started at age 15 for the state attorney's office. I happened to know the IT director there, and I was doing, just like Gary, desk support. And then eventually I went to college, but I messed up. I actually got hired as a mistake as a full-time software engineer because the computer science department at my university put out an announcement saying this company was looking to hire people. And I said, yeah, okay, great. And I applied. I had taken, AP Java, whatever in high school. So I think I knew enough, right?
Brilliant.
Right? That's what they teach you, right? AP Java, software engineering, same thing. And so I went and I applied. I got it somehow. And then they were like, when can you start? And I was like, well, I have classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And they were like, wait, what? But they liked me, so I stayed on.
So did you continue to go to college?
Yeah, so I was like part-time. It was like 20 hours the first year, 30 hours second year, and then I was full-time after that.
Almost like a paid internship. That sounds ideal.
It was awesome. I learned so much. I drank so much free soda from them. Thank you so much.
I have a semi-similar background to Sean in that I have a degree in computer science, but during university, my university hired me in the summers and during the year to work on some of their research projects as a programmer. So got exposed to a lot of Java, having basically the equivalent of probably AP Java and doing a lot of Symbian and phone J2ME stuff at the time.
Ooh.
Really aging myself here.
Symbian. I remember that era.
Yeah. Future.
If you think that's aging you, I can possibly beat that. The first programming language that I learned was Unibasic on a PIC system.
Oh, I did that too. But it was like a fun summer project for me.
Yeah, so I learned Unibasic back with my dad when I was like, 9 years old or something, because he was a programmer. And so I used to sort of sit with him and he'd get me to do bits of the code that he was doing for work. And then I sort of figured out how it was all working.
I assume you got a consulting fee of some sort, Aaron, yeah?
And no, I think he just was sort of skirting the child labor laws.
Okay.
And then from there picked up a number of different random jobs through school and all the rest of it. I did for a while I was working for a company that made those real estate magazines, and they used a system called PageMaker and then later InDesign. But PageMaker had this really weird kind of scripting language that you could use to pull the various images and text that the real estate agents was filling in about each of the properties, and then draw up the pages in this thing that was a bit like a high-end Microsoft publisher or something, and drew it all out on the page. And so you could use some logic inside the scripting language to do things like, if it was a portrait image, do it this way, and if it was a landscape image, do all that kind of stuff. So I had a whole bunch of random kind of tech-adjacent jobs through school and stuff like that. And then at university, I did not study anything related to computers. So at university, I studied law and accountancy. And yeah, exactly. One of those great kind of grown-up jobs that my mum liked. And while I was at university, I did do a bit more web stuff where I was doing the website for a pub and stuff like that, which the main problem with doing a website for a pub is trying to get interesting photos that don't have anything on there that's going to upset anybody.
What did you use to build the website for that pub?
It was very manual. I think I was using Notepad and PHP.
That sounds right.
The finest of text editors and languages.
Oh, God. Thank God I didn't have to learn PHP until way later.
All right, so we've got everyone's degrees. Now what? How do you get from degrees into jobs? We know about Sean, but Shane, how did you get from your degree into your job?
Yeah, my first job was as a PHP LAMP developer for a small startup back in Ireland. And by small, I mean just out of college, I was a lead engineer.
Oh, nice work.
Yeah. Managing 2 kids who hadn't graduated yet. So it was a real slick operation.
2 kids. As if they're not 2 years younger than you.
Yeah, exactly. The blind leading the blind. I literally had a copy of Code Complete trying to be like, how do you do this whole software engineering thing? Like, because computer science isn't how to program or how to build a business. It's like, here's sorting algorithms and here's assembler. Let's write an operating system. So yes, it was very much like trial by fire for probably my first few jobs. It was like programming and the web was reasonably established, but like the programming principles behind it were just a mess and just evolving at the time.
Sounds like all of you have trauma from PHP.
It wasn't good.
Well, for me, as I said, studied sound engineering and stage management and decided that I didn't want a career as a roadie and I could do computers. So I got a job at the local computer shop, worked there for a while, and then moved into working for a company that was, I'm going to say, building and selling point of sale systems. But the reality was that we were just installing Windows XP on some tills that had been imported from China and shipping them out the door. And then from there moved to being the IT guy at an insurance company with about 200 staff at about the age of 18 on my own. And that was like full, Windows network. There are a few SCO Unix boxes running some line of business software in there that I suddenly had to learn to look after. And yeah, that was a whole bunch of fun. I was there for about 2 years, moved on to doing desk-side support at an MSP, then moved to a company that was actually doing some proper stuff. Not that MSPs or installing dodgy copies of XP on tills isn't proper work. And then just kind of worked up from there, moved into the infrastructure team, took on more and more roles within that. And then eventually it got to a point where we just couldn't scale with the on-prem infrastructure that we had anymore and needed to move to cloud.
So I'm trying to get a gauge on timings. When was cloud around and when were you doing this?
So the first workloads that I probably deployed in the cloud were 2015 time. So it was still fairly early for a lot of stuff in Azure. Like there was certainly stuff that we wanted to use in Azure, but because we had a hybrid environment as we started to deploy this stuff, the VNet stuff on Azure wasn't super complete. Like we had a bunch of developers that wanted to use Azure Functions, and Azure Functions didn't have VNet integration back then. So we had to do like Azure function environments or whatever they were called, or run a bunch of our workloads in Windows workers on Kubernetes, which at the time was a thing because they were full fat .NET applications, and it was move these to the cloud, but don't interrupt the developers, leave them over their infrastructure team.
I remember back in like 2017, that's when I got really started with cloud, and I looked at Azure, which was, I think, one of the latest ones to come out. Like GCP and AWS had already been around for a while. And I remember looking at their stuff and them still not having a lot of basic functions. Oh, that hurts.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot for Windows Kubernetes worker nodes to be the preferred solution, right?
Wow.
But that's where we were.
Look how far we've come.
So, Sean, how did you get into the cloud side then?
So after my first job, after graduating from college, I ended up going to a small cloud company called Rackspace. They were based out of Texas. I was at the right place at the right time to enjoy a really special moment in Rackspace history. I was also there to see it fall from grace. and become my favorite place to work. So I eventually left after that to go work at Adobe. Gary, tell me, how much did you enjoy being desk support? Because that was by far my least favorite part of the job.
Do you know what? I quite enjoyed it, in as much as the work was relatively easy, albeit low paid. But the company I was working for was small enough that you could get to know everyone, and actually you could spend half an hour just helping someone at their desk, drinking a coffee and having a chat. And that was a good use of your time as far as management were concerned. And we were, I think it's probably fair to say, relatively immature when I joined that desk side support team. There wasn't much by way of automation. Like, people were still putting the Windows CD in the computer and installing everything manually, and everyone had like bespoke setups on their workstation. So
wow,
there was actually quite a lot that I did in that role to push that team forward, despite it being like a relatively junior role, like introducing standardized images for all the workstations and building those out with the correct applications on and things, which seemed revolutionary in this small business, but actually were just things that you had to do once you were managing 400 computers across 6 or 7 different offices around the world.
This episode is sponsored by Insta360, which you may know for its 360 and action cameras. They've just launched their brand new pocket camera, the Go Ultra. This tiny camera, about the size of an Oreo and weighing just 53 grams, is a game changer for creators on the go. You can throw it in your pocket, but it's powerful enough to shoot super smooth 4K 60 frame per second video. The built-in magnetic mounting system lets you clip it on your hat or your clothing for effortless point-of-view shots, or you can attach it to anything you can stick a magnet to for interesting angles without extra mounts. The camera has an upgraded 1/1.28-inch sensor and is IPX8 waterproof up to 33 feet. The Go Ultra's next-gen stacked polymer battery delivers super-fast charging and ultra-long runtime. 70 minutes plus 200 minutes with the Action Pod, and fast charging up to 80% in just 12 minutes, so you can take a break, deploy a few VMs, and be back to recording your next action-packed adventure. The Action Pod also lets you remotely control the standalone camera, and you can use Apple Find My to track it down if you lose it. Now, you can't stick to everything out there with a magnet, so if you want to grab yourself some free sticky tabs and attach your camera to anything you can think of, go to store.insta360.com and use the promo code HybridCloud for your Insta360 Go Ultra purchase, available for the first 30 purchases only. Okay, so let's look at the other bit of this question around the decision-making team that decided to go cloud and whether that's a good idea and the hurdles, etc., that were mentioned.
So I probably was the decision-making team for this when the cloud first appeared on my radar. Prior to that, I'd been managing basically Linux VPSs at a lot of the companies I worked at. And that was quite stressful because it was usually only me. There'll be a bunch of software engineers, including myself. But I always ended up, because I'd done a lot of Linux admin in university, that fell into my job a lot as well. And yeah, managing pets was really stressful. Having to tweak Apache config that you don't know about, it's poorly documented, and you've forgotten how you set this all up a couple of months ago. So in about 2011, I advocated for the company I was working at to move to AWS. The reason for that was because AWS had started to become quite big and it had really good documentation. I wanted those AMI builds and I wanted to do more load balancing because, again, didn't want to manage pets. I would like to be able to destroy servers. We've been looking at things like, maybe it was Chef at the time or Puppet, I can't remember. And yeah, it was to de-stress me, basically, to move to AWS.
That's interesting because that's really a move from VPSs to cloud, but not the whole on-premise bit of the question. So did you ever have on-prem as part of the equation when you were doing your stuff?
No, I suppose because where I was working, like it was London for many years and it was a lot of startups and scale-ups I worked at the time. And it would just be throw a bunch of engineers at the problem. Software engineers can do everything. You know, that whole Facebook mindset where the person who answered the phone was a software engineer. I guess a lot of companies bought into that. So we didn't have infrastructure people. It would be me when a server went down trying to figure out what the hell to do rather than having anyone dedicated or anything on-prem at all. I just wasn't working at those sizes of companies.
What about Gary, Sean? Did you do any of the sort of move to cloud stuff?
Yeah, I did. So I think most of this was at the company that I was talking about before, where they weren't particularly mature. So when I joined in 2014, 2015, we still had Itanium servers running in production, to give you an idea of where we were. And a lot of the stuff was essentially hosted out of a couple of quote unquote data centers, but realistically they were racks in a few branch offices that we had decent aircon and power redundancy and a diesel gen set out the back. So there was a lot of on-prem stuff, predominantly Dell kit with Cisco switching, variety of different firewalling technologies. And it was all a little bit of a mess, right? Yeah, virtualization was something that they just started to look at the time. We backed the wrong horse, in my opinion, with Hyper-V when we actually moved to do virtualization, but we were a Microsoft shop. I kind of get it. And within a couple of years, I think it became pretty clear that we needed to move to some more open technologies to orchestrate our stack that weren't Windows and .NET. So we moved to, for example, Nginx for a lot of our reverse proxy stuff off of Microsoft ISA server at the time, if anyone remembers that, which is what we were using for firewall. Redis came in, Elasticsearch came in. We started using HA proxy for load balancing. There was a whole bunch of these kind of open source technologies that lent themselves a bit more nicely to decoupling our stack from Microsoft. And then we signed a large contract to provide all of the images and video for some kind of supermarket in the US that will remain unnamed. But it was a large enough customer that they would come and hit our API and just kill stuff. And I was the junior infrastructure guy, and I was the person whose phone got paged at 3 a.m. when said supermarket swamped our API every single day, asking for photos of every product they sold.
Have they not heard of a CDN? Was that not a thing back then? I'm pretty sure it was.
I mean, it was a thing, but given that only a couple of years prior we were still retiring our last Itanium servers,
Oof.
It wasn't a thing that we were really interested in.
Man, Gary, you've had some trauma. School of hard knocks over there.
What about you, Sean? Were you moving things to the cloud?
Yes and no. So I started off with VMware and private cloud. And so it was already kind of cloud, but kind of on-prem, depending on the customer setup. But then VMware started coming up with a hybrid cloud approach, right? They had a whole entire product suite dedicated to this. And then in addition to having a hybrid cloud product suite, right, they then started allowing you to run your VMware workloads on the clouds. That was like VMC on AWS, right, and Azure and stuff. And then in addition to that, they even came out with their own vCloud solution, right, vCloud Director, right? So they had a way for you to provision things in a very cloudy manner, but with your on-prem resources. So it wasn't really that I decided to it. It was just a natural progression of what the industry offered me at that time. And it made a lot of sense to me, and I'm a big believer in it still today.
So what about this argument that a well-run on-premise solution is leaps and bounds better than giving up your control and data sovereignty?
It can be. It really depends on what your setup looks like. I would think that if you are in a highly regulated industry, then yes, that probably would make a lot of sense. But if you have ephemeral data, nothing that's PII, any identifiable information, then probably not. Especially the way that clouds give out money nowadays to anybody who's willing to come sign up for their accounts. I don't think that's a fair assumption to make.
Yeah, and I think for us, right, we were providing images and product data to supermarkets. There was nothing super sensitive there. So for us, the ability to scale beyond the limits of what we could have done on-prem and only pay for that scale when we needed it was a really big driver. And you couldn't do that on premises, right? There was a strong remit to leave the developers doing what they were doing, which was the attitude back in 2016, 2017. You didn't have these DevOps teams, as it were, but we were feeling the production pain of this cluster of 3 Dell servers that got absolutely hammered every time an API request got sent to us, because there was a bunch of compute that happened in the background in order to deliver those assets out for the customer. So the only way that we could satisfy this without buying a bunch of hardware to put in our already end-of-line data centers was to move to cloud. The company didn't have the capital in order to do that. We didn't have the developer hours in order to port this to something that was a little bit more cloud-friendly. And therefore, moving to Azure in the way that we did with Kubernetes, auto-scaling Windows worker nodes was a real game changer for us, because it meant that the team of 2 or 3 engineers that we had could focus on actually delivering value for the business.
Yeah, I think that's where I sort of look at a lot of this stuff is, at the end of the day, most people are trying to get a job done, and you need to focus on how are you going to get that job done most effectively, and how much of the underneath bits do you really want to be in charge of, because you can do it, but a lot of the ways I see people doing it these days is almost the flip side of how it was not that long ago. These days I see people doing as little as possible and starting at the, right up at the top layers of, I don't know, function as a service or platform as a service. And then as they need the flexibility of those lower layers, as they need to take more control of those lower layers, they start to, peel that back and maybe, do it in Kubernetes, or maybe they go down a layer and do it in VMs or whatever. And it's only if those things start to cause them issues that they go all the way down to the bare metal. And it's sort of starting up there and moving down, where you can build that whole thing up yourself if you want to, but is there a good business reason why you want to do it, as opposed to just doing it for the sake of it?
Well, and I think we've touched on a bunch of that stuff before, right? But if you're in an industry that requires that for legal reasons, regulatory reasons, compliance reasons, then absolutely, you've got little choice but to keep that on-prem, or go and have those very difficult conversations with your legislator or regulator. For me, I think there is a balance to be had between full stack engineer who does everything and just deploys it as a function, and then when you run into a problem, you don't necessarily know how to use some of those lower level solutions, and building and orchestrating all of this stuff yourself. Now, some might argue that Kubernetes is still building and orchestrating a bunch of this stuff yourself, but those people probably don't know the pain of like a fiber channel switch failing on a SAN and not having a spare on the shelf, as an example.
Yeah, I also think that this well run in this sentence is doing an awful lot of work.
Yeah.
Because there's a big difference between how most data centers I've seen are run and the sort of cloud APIs that I've seen in, all of the major public clouds.
Well, Aaron, you just said data center. Data center, not exactly on-prem, depending on who you are. Data centers could be construed as cloud as well. When we say on-prem, I'm thinking in the basement somewhere, or in the building somewhere, or close to, right? Maybe it's a block away or something. That's something about on-prem, right? That's where you have limited finite real estate to have limited finite resources. You might not be able to scale out to what a certain unnamed grocery company might hit your API for. But if you're in a data center, then you probably do have those resources and the ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we didn't have contracts with a large data center provider, right? We had 5 racks in our HQ, we had 5 racks in a DR site, and then we had a couple of half-height racks in an office in the Netherlands. And that's what we had to scale into. And we couldn't just phone Dell and get a new box the next day. There was a 6-week lead time in having someone spec that up for us, the hardware become available, some kind of larger company gazump us because they needed the SSDs more than we did, and getting that to us. That is a long process, let alone you've got a 3-man team who are managing production, helping developers, doing deployments, everything else, getting that installed, racked up, tested, configured, everything else. Like that end to end could be a 3-month process from going, yeah, we need more compute, and actually having that online and available. And I don't necessarily think that's because the infrastructure isn't well run. I think that is just the reality of working in a medium-sized business.
Let's say you get to a certain stage as a company and you need to either buy into on-prem or buy into a cloud. Going on-prem is going to be expensive to start with, not just in money, but also in you're now building out a kind of commodity function within your own company. Like it's not a differentiator. You might run it well and it might be long-term cost effective, but it's not going to make your product any better really. So it's a hard call to make at that stage because it's just it introduces a lot of risk. And again, you're skilling out people who are maybe completely different skill set to what you've ever hired before. So there's a real risk in that as well. So I can understand why people wouldn't want to take that risk and sort of rent it from Amazon for a while.
Well, it's the undifferentiated heavy lifting, to borrow the phrase from Amazon, that they pride themselves on, right? Is I could never build a data center as well as one of the hyperscalers, primarily because I don't have the resource to do so, but also because I and the other two guys in my team are not experts in switching, networking, firewalling, storage, whatever else. We can do our best and we can go and get the advanced Dell storage administrator cert. We can go and get our Hyper-V administrator certs or whatever it is. We can go and get our CISSP for security. But we are just a team of 3 or 4 people. We are not thousands of engineers who are doing this stuff day in, day out. You know, in an AWS data center, there is probably a guy who just looks after deciding what fiber transceivers to buy. And you're never going to have that luxury as a smaller company.
I think all of that said, I think it is possible to run either a data center or on-prem. I mean, I'd be surprised these days if people really are making sensible decisions to install servers and things in an office without cooling and power, etc. But I'm sure it is happening.
So one of the startups I worked at, this was not my decision, but when I joined, they worked in an office in London, right on the Thames. It was lovely, but it had a huge window. And in the summer, it got really hot. And for some reason, someone decided that they were also going to put a lot of racks in the office, in this hot, old London office. But all it hosted was all our internal apps like Rocket Chat and whatever the LinkedIn, Facebook clone was. But yes, it would bake the office as well as the sun baking the office. So we had to get blackout curtains to block all the windows so we didn't get any sun in the office because the servers were too hot. We could not function with the heat from the servers and the heat from the windows. So rather than get rid of the servers, we blocked the sun out.
I remember having an amusing conversation with the CEO of one of the companies I worked at where our on-prem data center was backing onto reception and there was a door that we had like boarded up. Security, right? You know, we'd boarded it up. We put some racking in it with our spare parts in front of this door. And he said, we should just make that a glass door so people can see all the servers. It's like, the first question people are going to ask is, why are they here? This should be a point of shame. I don't want people in reception seeing the higgledy-piggledy mess of PowerEdge boxes that we have running this show.
Anyway, where I was going with that is, even if you've got these, if you're doing the whole on-prem or data, wherever it is, I do think it is possible to run an on-premise setup properly. Like, I do think you can do all the layers of APIs and cloudify your hardware and, do all of that kind of metal as a service or whatever. And then you go up the layers with your, your virtualization stack, your Kubernetes stack, whatever. Yeah, I know you can do it all. And if you do it all properly, I think you can end up with an exceptionally good setup. It's just that I think a lot of people don't.
It's tough to do. There's so many skills required, right? That's why you outsource them. But you can hire them. And people are doing this successfully. And I don't mean just like private cloud, I mean on-prem. So I'm excited for that. That's what hybrid cloud can be all about, right? And that's what I believe in. I believe there is definitely a place for on-prem and private cloud. I especially think that one of those areas that I really like to see is like maybe not a well-run private cloud, because that's just so encompassing of so much things nowadays, but maybe like a really good on-prem team or an on-prem platform. Like maybe you have a database as a service platform that is on-prem, and that allows your company to host its data and keep its data really tightly controlled and where it can be, but it's just as easy to run as any one of the hyperscalers. I think that could be a really good thing. That's a small niche that has the right scope for a company to really execute well on. But if you're trying to have it do everything the cloud does, then you're never going to get there.
Well, that's probably a good place to wrap things up. Before we do, just a quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you have any questions or feedback, you can send them to us at show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.